Chapter 8. Comrades. I was, of course, most attracted to the men of my own sort. The gentlemen, that is, especially at first. But of the 3 Russian convicts of that class who were in our prison, Akim Akimych, the spy A, and the man who was believed to have killed his father, the only one I knew and talked to was Akim Akimych. I must confess that I resorted to Akim Akimych only, so to say, in despair, at moments of the most intense boredom and when there was no prospect of speaking to anyone else. In the last chapter I have tried to arrange all the convicts in classes, but now I recall Akim Akimych, I think that one might add another class. It is true that he would be the only representative of it. That is, the class of the absolutely indifferent convicts. Absolutely indifferent convicts, those, that is, to whom it was a matter of indifference whether they lived in prison or in freedom, one would have supposed did not and could not exist. But I think Akim Akimych was an example of one. He had established himself in prison indeed, as though he meant to spend his life there. Everything about him, his mattress, his pillows, his pots and pans, all were on a solid and permanent footing. There was nothing of a temporary, bivouacking character about him. He had many years still to be in prison, but I doubt whether he ever thought of leaving it. But if he were reconciled to his position, it was not from inclination, but from subordination, though indeed in his case it amounted to the same thing. He was a good-natured man, and he helped me indeed at first with advice and kind offices. But I confess sometimes, especially at first, he produced in me an intense depression which still further increased my misery. Yet it was my misery drove me to talk to him. I longed sometimes for a living word, however bitter or impatient or spiteful. We might at least have railed at our destiny together. But he was silent, gumming his paper lamps, or he would tell me of the review in which he had taken part in such a year, and who was the commanding officer of the division, and what his Christian name was, and whether he had been satisfied with the review, and how the signals for the gunners had been changed, and all in the same even, decorous voice like the dripping of water. He scarcely showed the slightest animation when he told me that he had been deemed worthy to receive the ribbon of St. Anne on his sword for the part he had taken in some action in the Caucasus. Only at that moment his voice became extraordinarily dignified and solemn. It dropped to a mysterious undertone when he pronounced the words St. Anne, and for 3 minutes afterwards he became particularly silent and sedate. During that first year I had stupid moments when I, and always quite suddenly, began, I don't know why, almost to hate Akim Akimych, and I cursed the fate which had put me with my head next his on the common bed. Usually an hour later I reproached myself for the feeling. But this was only during my first year. Later on I became quite reconciled to Akim Akimych in my heart, and was ashamed of my foolishness. Outwardly, as far as I remember, we were always on good terms. Besides these 3 Russians, there were 8 others, Polish prisoners, of the upper class in the prison while I was there. Some of them I got to know pretty well and was glad of their friendship, but not all. The best of them were morbid, exceptional, and intolerant to the last degree. With 2 of them I gave up talking altogether in the end. Only 3 of them were well educated, B, M, and Z, who had been a professor of mathematics, a nice good-natured old man, very eccentric and not at all clever, I think, in spite of his education. M and B were men of a quite different type. I got on well with M from the first. I respected him and never quarrelled with him, but I never could get fond of him or feel any affection for him. He was a profoundly mistrustful and embittered man with a wonderful power of self-control. But this very excess of self-control was what I did not like. One somehow felt that he would never open his heart to anyone. But perhaps I am mistaken. He was a man of strong and very noble character. His extreme and almost Jesuitical skill and circumspection in dealing with people betrayed his profound inner skepticism. Yet his was a soul tormented just by this duality, skepticism and a deep, steadfast faith in some of his own hopes and convictions. But for all his skill in getting on with people, he was an irreconcilable enemy of B, and of the latter's friend, T. B was a man in ill health, of consumptive tendency, nervous and irritable, but at bottom a very kind-hearted and even great-hearted man. His irritability sometimes reached the pitch of extreme intolerance and caprice. I could not put up with his temper, and in the end I gave up having anything to do with B, but I never ceased to love him. With M I never quarrelled, but I never was fond of him. It happened that, through cutting off my relations with B, I had also to give up T, the young man of whom I have spoken in the last chapter when I described our complaint. I was very sorry for that. Though T was not an educated man, he was kind-hearted and manly, a splendid young fellow, in fact. He was so fond of B, had such a respect and reverence for him, that if anyone were ever so little at variance with B, he at once looked upon him almost as an enemy. I believe in the end he was estranged even from M on B's account, though he held out for a long time. But they were all morally sick, embittered, irritable, and mistrustful. It was easy to understand. It was very hard for them, much worse than for us. They were far from their own country. Some of them were exiled for long periods, 10 or 12 years, and what was worse, they regarded everyone around them with intense prejudice, saw in the convicts nothing but their brutality, could not discern any good quality, anything human in them, and had indeed no wish to do so. And, as was very easy to understand also, they were led to this unfortunate point of view by the force of circumstance, by fate. There is no doubt that they were very miserable in prison. To the Circassians, to the Tatars, and to Isai Fomitch they were cordial and friendly, but shunned the other convicts with abhorrence. Only the Starodubovsky Old Believer won their entire respect. It is remarkable, however, that all the while I was in prison, none of the convicts ever taunted them with their nationality and their religion or their ideas, as Russian peasants sometimes, though very rarely, do with foreigners, especially Germans. Though perhaps they do no more than laugh at the Germans. A German is always an extremely comic figure in the eyes of the Russian peasant. The convicts treated our foreign prisoners respectfully in prison, far more so than the Russian gentlemen prisoners indeed, and they never touched them. But the latter seemed unwilling to notice and consider this fact. I have spoken of T. It was he who, when they were walking from their first place of exile to our prison, carried B in his arms almost the whole journey, when the latter, weak in health and constitution, broke down before half the day's march was over. They had at first been exiled to U. There, so they said, they were well off, that is, much better off than in our prison. But they got up a correspondence, of a perfectly harmless character, however, with some other exiles in another town, and for this reason it was considered necessary to exile these 3 to our fortress, where they would be under the eye of a higher official. Their third comrade was Z. Till they came, M was the only Pole in the prison. How miserable he must have been in his first year there. This Z was the old man who was always saying his prayers, as I have mentioned before. All our political prisoners were young, some mere boys. Only Z was a man over 50. He was a man of unquestionable honesty, but rather strange. His comrades B and T disliked him very much. They did not even speak to him. They used to say of him that he was quarrelsome, obstinate, and fussy. I don't know how far they were right. In prison, as in all places where people are kept together in a crowd against their will, I think people quarrel and even hate one another more easily than in freedom. Many circumstances combine to bring this about. But Z certainly was a rather stupid and perhaps disagreeable man. None of his other comrades were on good terms with him. Though I never quarreled with him, I did not get on with him particularly well. I believe he knew his own subject, mathematics. I remember that he was always trying to explain to me in his broken Russian some special astronomical system he had invented. I was told that he had once published an account of it, but the learned world had only laughed at him. I think he was a little cracked. For whole days together he was on his knees saying his prayers, for which all the convicts respected him to the day of his death. He died before my eyes in our hospital after a severe illness. He won the convicts' respect, however, from the first moment in prison after the incident with our major. On the journey from U to our prison they had not been shaved, and they had grown beards. So when they were led straight to the major, he was furiously indignant at such a breach of discipline, though they were in no way to blame for it. "What do they look like?" he roared. "They are tramps! Brigands!" Z, who at that time knew very little Russian and thought they were being asked who they were, tramps or brigands, answered, "We are not tramps. We are political prisoners." "What? You are insolent! Insolent!" roared the major. "To the guardhouse! 100 lashes at once, this instant!" The old man was flogged. He lay down under the lashes without a protest, bit his hand, and endured the punishment without a cry, a moan, or a movement. Meanwhile, B and T went into the prison, where M, already waiting for them at the gate, fell on their necks, though he had never seen them before. Agitated by the way the major had received them, they told M all about Z. I remember how M told me about it. "I was beside myself," he said. "I did not know what was happening to me and shivered as though I were in a fever. I waited for Z at the gate. He would have to come straight from the guardhouse where the flogging took place." Suddenly the gate opened. Z came out with a pale face and trembling white lips, and without looking at anyone, passed through the convicts who were assembled in the yard and already knew that a gentleman was being flogged. He went into the prison ward, straight to his place, and without saying a word, knelt down and began to pray. The convicts were impressed and even touched. "When I saw that old grey-headed man," said M., "who had left a wife and children in his own country, when I saw him on his knees praying after a shameful punishment, I rushed behind the prison, and for 2 hours I did not know what I was doing. I was frantic." The convicts had a great respect for Z from that time forward, and they always treated him respectfully. What they particularly liked was that he had not cried out under punishment. One must be fair, however. One cannot judge of the behavior of the authorities in Siberia to prisoners of the educated class, whoever they may be, Poles or Russians, from this instance. This instance only shows that one may come across a bad man, and of course if that bad man is an independent senior officer somewhere, the fate of an exile whom that bad man particularly disliked would be very insecure. But one must admit that the highest authorities in Siberia, upon whom the tone and disposition of all the other commanding officers depend, is very scrupulous in regards to exiles of the upper class, and is even in some cases disposed to favor them in comparison with other convicts of the peasant class. The reasons for this are clear. These higher authorities, to begin with, belong to the privileged class themselves. Secondly, it has happened in the past that some of the exiles of this class have refused to lie down to be flogged and have attacked the officers, which has led to terrible consequences. And thirdly, I believe the chief explanation is that 35 years ago a great mass of exiles of the upper class were sent to Siberia all at once, and these exiles had succeeded in the course of 30 years in establishing their character throughout Siberia, so that from an old traditional habit the government in my day could not help looking upon political prisoners as very different from ordinary convicts. The subordinate officers were accustomed to look upon them in the same way, taking their tone and attitude from the higher authorities, of course, and following their lead. But many of these commanding officers of inferior rank were stupid and secretly critical of the instructions given them, and they would have been very glad if they could have made their own arrangements without being checked. But this was not altogether permitted. I have good reason for this belief, and I will give it. The second class of penal servitude in which I was serving, imprisonment in the fortress under military command, was incomparably more severe than the other two divisions, that is, servitude in the mines and in government works. It was not only harder for prisoners of the privileged class, but for all the convicts, simply because the government and organization of this division was all military and not unlike that of the disciplinary battalions in Russia. Military government is harsher, the regulations are stricter, one is always in chains, always under guard, always behind bars and bolts. And this is not so much the case in the other two divisions. So at least all our convicts said, and there were some amongst them who knew what they were talking about. They would all gladly have passed into the first division, which is reckoned by the law to be the hardest, and often dreamed of the change. Of the disciplinary battalions in Russia, all who had been in them spoke with horror, declaring that in all Russia nothing was harder than the disciplinary battalions in the fortresses, so that Siberia was paradise compared with a life in them. So if, in harsh conditions as in our prison under military rule, before the eyes of the Governor-General himself, and in spite of the possibility, such things sometimes occurred, of officious outsiders through spite or jealousy secretly reporting that certain political prisoners were favored by officers of doubtful loyalty. If in such circumstances, I repeat, the political prisoners were looked upon somewhat differently from the other convicts, they must have been treated even more leniently in the first and third divisions. So I believe I can judge in this respect of all Siberia by the place where I was. All the tales and rumors that reached me on this subject from exiles of the first and third divisions confirmed my conclusion. In reality, all of us, prisoners of the upper class, were treated by the authorities with more attention and circumspection in our prison. We certainly had no favor shown us in regard to work or other external conditions. We had the same work, the same fetters, the same bolts and bars. In fact, we had everything exactly like the other convicts. and indeed it was impossible to mitigate our lot. I know that in that town, in the recent but so remote past, there were so many spies, so many intrigues, so many people laying traps for one another, that it was natural that the governing authorities should be afraid of being denounced. And what could be more terrible at that period than to be accused of showing favor to political prisoners? And so all were afraid, and we lived on an equal footing with all the convicts. But as regards corporal punishment, there was a certain difference. It is true they would readily have flogged us if we had deserved it, that is, had committed a misdemeanor. That much was dictated by official duty and equality as regards corporal punishment. But they would not have flogged us at random on the impulse of the moment, and, of course, cases of such wanton treatment of the common convicts did occur, especially with some commanding officers of lower rank who enjoyed domineering and intimidation. We knew that the governor of the prison was very indignant with the major when he knew the story of old Z, and impressed upon him the necessity of restraining himself in the future. So I was told by everyone. It was known also in prison that the governor-general, too, though he trusted and to some extent liked our major as a man of some ability who did his duty, reprimanded him about that affair. And the major had made a note of it. He would dearly have liked, for example, to lay hands upon M, whom he hated from the tales A told him, but he was never able to flog him, though he persecuted him and was on the lookout for a pretext and ready to pounce upon him. The whole town soon heard of the Z affair, and public opinion condemned the major. Many people reproved him, and some made themselves very unpleasant. I remember at this moment my first encounter with the major. When we were at Tobolsk, the other political prisoner with whom I entered the prison, and myself, they frightened us by telling us of this man's ferocious character. Some old political exiles, who had been in Siberia for 25 years and who met us at Tobolsk with great sympathy and kept up relations with us all the time we were in the forwarding prison, warned us against our future commanding officer and promised to do what they could, through certain prominent persons, to protect us from his persecution. 3 daughters of the governor-general, who had come from Russia and were staying with their father, did, in fact, receive letters from them, and spoke about us to their father. But what could he do? He merely told the major to be more careful. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my comrade and I arrived in the town, and the guards took us at once to the major. We stood in the entry waiting for him. Meanwhile, they sent for the prison sergeant. As soon as he appeared, the major, too, came out. His spiteful, purple, pimply face made a very depressing impression. It was as though a malicious spider had run out to pounce on some poor fly that had fallen into its web. "What's your name?" he asked my comrade. He spoke rapidly, sharply, abruptly. He evidently wished to make an impression on us. "So-and-so?" "You?" he went on, addressing me and glaring at me through his spectacles. "So-and-so?" "Sergeant! To prison with them at once! Shave them in the guard-house! Half the head as civilian prisoners! Change their fetters tomorrow!" "What coats are those? Where did you get them?" he answered suddenly, his attention being caught by the grey overcoats with yellow circles on the back which had been given us at Tobolsk, and which we were wearing in his illustrious presence. "That's a new uniform! It must be a new uniform. A new pattern. From Petersburg," he added, making us turn round one after the other. "They've nothing with them?" he asked the escort. "They've got their own clothes, your honour," said the gendarme, drawing himself up suddenly with a positive start. Everyone knew of the Major. Everyone had heard of him. Everyone was frightened of him. "Take away everything. Only give them back their underlinen, the white things. If there are any colored things, take them away, and sell all the rest by auction. The money for the prison funds. The convict has no property," he added, looking at us sternly. "Mind you behave yourselves. Don't let me hear of you, or corporal punishment. For the least misdemeanor, the lash." This reception, which was unlike anything I was used to, made me almost ill the whole evening. And the impression was increased by what I saw in the prison. But I have already described my first hours in prison. I have mentioned already that the authorities did not, and dared not, show us any favor or make our tasks lighter than those of the other convicts. But on one occasion they did try to do so. For 3 whole months, B and T used to go to the engineer's office to do clerical work there. But this was done in strict secrecy, and was the engineering officer's doing. That is to say, all the other officials concerned knew of it, but they pretended not to. That happened when G was commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel G was a perfect godsend for the short time he was with us. Not more than 6 months, if I mistake not, rather less perhaps. He made an extraordinary impression on the convicts before he left them to return to Russia. It was not simply that the convicts loved him. They adored him, if such a word may be used in this connection. How he did it I don't know, but he gained their hearts from the first moment. "He is a father to us, a father. We've no need of a father," the convicts were continually saying all the time he was at the head of the engineering department. I believe he was a terribly dissipated character. He was a little man with a bold, self-confident expression. But at the same time he was kind, almost tender with the convicts, and he really did love them like a father. Why he was so fond of the convicts I can't say, but he could not see a convict without saying something kindly and good-humored to him, without making a joke or laughing with him, and the best of it was there was no trace of the authoritative manner in it, nothing suggestive of condescending or purely official kindness. He was their comrade and completely one of themselves. But although he was instinctively democratic in manner and feeling, the convicts were never once guilty of disrespect or familiarity with him. On the contrary. But the convict's whole face lighted up when he met the lieutenant colonel, and, taking off his cap, he was all smiles when the latter came up to him. And if the officer spoke, the convict felt as though he had received a present. There are popular people like this. He looked a manly fellow. He walked with an erect and gallant carriage. "He is an eagle," the convicts used to say of him. He could, of course, do nothing to mitigate their lot. He was only at the head of the engineering work, which, having been settled and laid down by law once for all, went on unchanged, whoever was in command. At most, if he chanced to come across a gang of convicts whose work was finished, he would let them go home before the drum sounded, instead of keeping them hanging about for nothing. But the convicts liked his confidence in them, the absence of petty fault-finding and irritability, the utter lack of anything insulting in speech or manner in his official relations with them. If he had lost 1,000 rubles, and a convict had picked the money up, I do believe, if it were the worst thief in prison, he would have restored it. Yes, I am sure of that. With intense sympathy, the convicts learnt that their eagle had a deadly quarrel with our hated major. It happened during the first month G was there. Our major had at some time served with him in the past. After years of separation, they met as friends and used to drink together. But their relations were suddenly cut short. They quarreled, and G became his mortal enemy. There was a rumor that they had even fought on the occasion, which was by no means out of the question with our major. He often did fight. When the convicts heard of this, their delight knew no bounds. "As though old Eight Eyes could get on with a man like him! He is an eagle, but the major a—" And here usually followed a word quite unfit for print. The prisoners were fearfully interested to know which had given the other a beating. If the rumors of the fight had turned out to be false, which was perhaps the case, I believe our convicts would have been very much annoyed. "You may be sure the colonel got the best of it," they used to say. "He's a plucky one, though he is small, and the major crawled under the bed to get away from him, they say." But G soon left us, and the convicts sank into despondency again. Our engineering commanders were all good, however. 3 or 4 succeeded one another in my time. "But we shall never have another like him," the convicts used to say. "He was an eagle and our champion." This G was very fond of us political prisoners, and towards the end he used to make B and me come to work in his office sometimes. After he went away, this was put on a more regular footing. Some in the engineering department, especially one of them, were very sympathetic with us. We used to go there and copy papers. Our handwriting began to improve even, when suddenly there came a peremptory order from the higher authorities that we were to be sent back to our former tasks. Someone had already played the spy. It was a good thing, however. We had both begun to be fearfully sick of the office. Afterwards, for 2 years, B and I went almost inseparably to the same tasks, most frequently to the workshops. We used to chat together, talk of our hopes and convictions. He was a splendid fellow, but his ideas were sometimes very strange and exceptional. There is a certain class of people, very intelligent indeed, who sometimes have utterly paradoxical ideas. But they have suffered so much for them in their lives, they have paid such a heavy price for them, that it would be too painful, almost impossible, to give them up. B listened to every criticism with pain and answered with bitterness. I dare say he was more right than I was in many things. I don't know. But at last we parted, and I was very sad about it. We had shared so many things together. Meanwhile, M seemed to become more melancholy and gloomy every year. He was overwhelmed by depression. During my early days in prison, he used to be more communicative. His feelings found a fuller and more frequent utterance. He had been 2 years in prison when I first came. At first he took interest in a great deal of what had happened in the world during those 2 years, of which he had no idea in prison. He questioned me, listened, was excited. But towards the end, as the years went on, he seemed to be more concentrated within and shut up in his own mind. The glowing embers were being covered up by ash. His exasperation grew more and more marked. "Je hais ces brigands," he often repeated to me, looking with hatred at the convicts, whom I had by then come to know better, and nothing I could say in their favor had any influence. He did not understand what I said, though he sometimes gave an absent-minded assent, but next day he would say again, "Je hais ces brigands." We used often to talk in French, by the way, and on this account a soldier in the engineers, called Tranishnikov, nicknamed us the Medicals. I don't know from what connection of ideas. M only showed warmth when he spoke of his mother. "She is old, she is ill," he said to me. "She loves me more than anything in the world, and here I don't know whether she is alive or dead. To know that I had to run the gauntlet was enough for her." M did not come of the privileged class, and before being sent to exile had received corporal punishment. He used to clench his teeth and look away when he recalled it. Towards the end he used more and more frequently to walk alone. One morning, about midday, he was summoned by the governor. Our governor came out to him with a good-humored smile. "Well, M, what did you dream about last night?" he asked. "I trembled," M told us afterwards. "I felt as though I had been stabbed to the heart." "I dreamt I had a letter from my mother," he answered. "Better than that," replied the governor. "You are free. Your mother has petitioned in your favor, and her petition has been granted. Here is her letter, and here is the order relating to you. You will leave the prison at once." He came back to us pale, unable to recover from the shock. We congratulated him. He pressed our hands with his cold and trembling hands. Many of the common convicts, too, congratulated him and were delighted at his good luck. He was released and remained in our town as a settler. Soon he was given a post. At first he often came to our prison, and when he could, told us all sorts of news. Politics was what interested him most. Besides M, T, B, and Z, there were two quite young men who had been sent for brief terms, boys of little education, but honest, simple, and straightforward. A third, A. Sochaczewski, was quite a simpleton, and there was nothing special about him. But a fourth, B.M., a middle-aged man, made a very disagreeable impression upon all of us. I don't know how he came to be one of the political prisoners, and indeed he denied all connection with them himself. He had the coarse soul of a petty huckster, and the habits and principles of a shopkeeper who had grown rich by cheating over halfpence. He was entirely without education, and took no interest in anything but his trade. He was a painter, and a first-rate one, magnificent. Soon the authorities heard of his talent, and all the town began wanting B.M. to paint their walls and ceilings. Within 2 years he had painted almost all the officials' houses. Their owners paid him out of their own pockets, and so he was not at all badly off. But the best of it was that his comrades, too, began to be sent to work with him. 2 who went out with him continually learnt the trade, too, and one of them, II.VIII., became as good a painter as he was himself. Our major, who lived in a government house himself, sent for B.M. in his turn, and told him to paint all the walls and ceilings. Then B.M. did his utmost. Even the Governor-General's house was not so well painted. It was a tumble-down, very mangy-looking one-story wooden house, but the interior was painted as though it were a palace, and the major was highly delighted. He rubbed his hands and declared that now he really must get married. "With such a house one must have a wife," he added quite seriously. He was more and more pleased with B.M., and through him the others who worked with him. The work lasted a whole month. In the course of that month the major quite altered his views of the political prisoners, and began to patronize them. It ended by his summoning Z one day from the prison. "Z," said he, "I wronged you. I gave you a flogging for nothing. I know it. I regret it. Do you understand that? I regret it." Z replied that he did understand it. "Do you understand that I, your commanding officer, have sent for you to ask you your forgiveness? Do you feel that? What are you beside me? A worm, less than a worm. You are a convict. And I, by the grace of God, am a major. A major, do you understand that?" Z answered that he understood that too. "Well, now I am making peace with you. But do you feel it? Do you feel it fully, in all its fullness? Are you capable of understanding it? Only think, I, the major," and so on. Z told me of the whole scene himself. So even this drunken, quarrelsome, and vicious man had some humane feeling. But when one takes into consideration his ideas and lack of culture, such an action may almost be called magnanimous. But probably his drunken condition had a good deal to do with it. His dreams were not realized. He did not get married, though he had fully made up his mind to do so by the time the decoration of his house was finished. Instead of being married, he was arrested, and he was ordered to send in his resignation. At the trial, all his old sins were brought up against him. He had previously been a provost of the town. The blow fell on him unexpectedly. There was immense rejoicing in the prison at the news. It was a festive day, a day of triumph. They said that the major howled like an old woman and was dissolved into tears. But there was nothing to be done. He retired, sold his pair of greys, and then his whole property, and even sank into poverty. We came across him afterwards, a civilian wearing a shabby coat and a cap with a cockade in it. He looked viciously at the convicts. But all his prestige went with his uniform. In a uniform he was terrible, a deity. In civil dress he became absolutely a non-entity, and looked like a lackey. It's wonderful what the uniform does for men like that. Breaking in. Toward the end of this chapter, Dostoevsky himself adds a note regarding the major's use of the expression, "by the grace of God." He writes, quote, "This expression was literally used in my time, not only by the major, but by many petty officers, especially those who had risen from the lower ranks." Unquote. The idea is that many of the officers would speak as though their rank was by divine appointment. When he refers to an event of some 35 years prior that flooded Siberia with political prisoners, Dostoevsky is referring to the famous Decembrist revolt of 1825. On the first day of the reign of Nicholas I, a group of military officers attempted to overthrow the Tsar in favor of a representative government. The revolt was swiftly put down, and the population of political prisoners swiftly exploded. That change in the population of Siberia, our author suggests, partly explains the kinder treatment of the politicals when it came to corporal punishment. The most significant feature of this chapter, however, concerns his relationship with the Polish prisoners M and B. Our narrator is circumspect about the origins of the rift between himself and B. We know that it concerns a disagreement in ideas, but have no clear signs here of what those ideas were. Other sources complete the picture. B, like most of his compatriots, was in the prison due to his opposition to the Russian occupation of Poland. But Dostoevsky supported that occupation and argued for it. Later on, T, B's close comrade, would report that Dostoevsky's enthusiasm on this score would reach such a pitch that he seemed, quote, affected by insanity, unquote. Related to this political disagreement would be a religious one. You may have noted the use of the adjective Jesuitical in describing M. In his later work, Dostoevsky would often make reference to the Catholics in general, and particularly to the Jesuits, as though they were a force for evil. Perhaps the greatest example of this is his famous Legend of the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov. In her book on the subject, Elizabeth Blake traces the origins of this trend to Dostoevsky's encounter with the Polish prisoners, who were allied with the Jesuits. Their revolutionary activities would have received support from the Catholic clergy, and Dostoevsky would come to see the methods of the Jesuits as conniving and manipulative. Even here we see the Jesuits being associated with M's distant, calculating, and mistrustful tone toward others. Connected to all this is one more thing. The Poles, and especially M's, disdain for the Russian peasant convicts by whom they were surrounded. We will see more on this theme a bit later with the brief story The Peasant Mary. End of comments.